When the lawyer said my name, my mother looked at me like I was stealing something that belonged to her. The room was too quiet for a place where millions of dollars were about to be discussed. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the soft rustle of paper in the lawyer's hands, and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second felt heavier than the last. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, my back straight, my face at least on the outside. Across from me sat my mother, the woman who had left me. When I was 16, she didn't smile. She didn't nod. Her eyes kept drifting back to the thick folder on the table as if it were calling her name. To her, this wasn't a family gathering. It was a transaction. The lawyer cleared his throat. As per the last will and testament of Mr. Robert Hale, that was my uncle. The man who raised me. The man who saved me, and the reason we were all here. I felt my mother's gaze land on me again, sharp, measuring. There was no warmth in it. No guilt, only calculation. And just like that, I was 16 again. I was 16 the day my mother decided she didn't want me anymore. I remember it clearly because I had walked home from school that afternoon, annoyed and tired, already planning what I would say when I got inside. I was going to complain about a math test, about how unfair the teacher was, about how exhausted I felt. But when I opened the front door, the house didn't smell like dinner. It smelled empty. The living room looked the same at first glance, but something felt off. Too still, too quiet. Her shoes were gone. Her coat wasn't on the hook. I walked into the bedroom and saw half the closet empty, drawers pulled out, hangers swinging slightly as if they were still confused. On the kitchen counter, there was a single piece of paper. I need to live my life. You'll understand someday. No apology, no explanation, no plan, just a sentence and then she was gone. I stood there for a long time holding that note, reading it again and again, waiting for the words to change, waiting for my phone to ring, waiting for her to come back and say it was a mistake. She never did. That night I slept on the couch with the lights on, because the silence was too loud. The only person who showed up for me was my uncle. Robert, my mother's older brother. He wasn't a man of many words. He spoke softly, moved slowly, and always seemed to think before he said anything. When he arrived at the house after I called him, he didn't ask 100 questions. He didn't criticize my mother out loud. He just looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Pack a bag. You're coming with me." At his house, everything was different. Quieter, safer. He made simple meals and left sticky notes on the fridge, reminding me to eat. He drove me to school every morning, even when I told him I could take the bus. At night, he would sit in the living room reading while I did my homework. Neither of us talking much, but I never felt alone. Once, on my first night there, I asked, "Is she coming back?" He paused, then said gently, "Some people don't know how to stay." That was the closest he ever came to criticizing her. Years passed, I grew up. I graduated. I worked 2 jobs through college, even though my uncle quietly paid my tuition without telling me until later. I learned how to survive without expecting anyone to choose me. Because the one person who should have already hadn't, my mother never called, never wrote, never checked. Not on birthdays, not on graduations, not once. Sometimes I wondered if she ever thought about me, but then I would remember how easily she left. And the wondering would turn into something harder, something heavier. Uncle Robert became my anchor. He taught me how to budget, how to cook, how to fix things around the house. When I got sick, he sat outside my room and checked on me every hour. When I doubted myself, he reminded me quietly, steadily, that I mattered. Once, when I was 20. I asked him if my mother ever talked about me. He looked out the window for a long moment and said, "You were never the problem." I held on to those words like a lifeline. Then came the phone call. Uncle Robert had been in an accident. I remember the hospital lights. It's too bright and too cold. The machines beeping. His hand in mine, warm but weak. He smiled at me and said, "You did good, kid." A week later, he was gone. And suddenly, my mother came back, not with tears, not with regret, but with interest. She called me for the first time in over a decade, asking about the funeral, asking about the house, asking questions she had no right to ask. At the service, she cried loudly, dramatically, holding tissues and shaking her head as if she had lost someone she loved deeply. I stood there quietly, knowing the truth. She hadn't come back for me. She had come back for what? She thought she was owed, which is how we ended up in that lawyer's office. The air is thick. The silence is sharp. The lawyer opened the folder and my mother leaned forward. Ready to collect, she just didn't know what my uncle had really left behind. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began reading. His voice steady, practiced like he had done this many times before. My personal effects, he said, including clothing, tools, and household items, are to be distributed according to the attached list. My mother shifted in her chair. I could feel her impatience without even looking at her. These were not the words she was waiting for. She crossed one leg over the other, tapping her heels softly against the floor. A rhythm of expectation. The lawyer continued. I leave the sum of $20,000 to my sister, Margaret Hale. My mother straightened instantly. 20,000. Her lips pressed together, not in gratitude, but calculation. She glanced at me again, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were already comparing numbers in her head. The lawyer paused, turned a page, then said my name. I leave the remainder of my estate, my home, my savings, my investments, and all remaining assets to my niece. The room seemed to tilt for a brief moment. No one spoke. The ticking clock grew louder, almost mocking. I felt heat rush to my face, my fingers curling into my palms. Then my mother laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was sharp, disbelieving, almost offended. That can't be right, she said, leaning forward. I'm his sister. The lawyer nodded calmly. It is correct, ma'am. This will be updated 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I remembered that year. Uncle Robert had started slowing down. He talked more about the future and asked me questions about my plans, my goals. He had asked me once, gently, if something happens to me, you'll be okay, right? I hadn't known what he meant then. My mother turned to me fully now, her voice low and urgent. You knew about this. I shook my head. No. Her face hardened. Then you don't deserve it. Okay, there it was. Not grief. Not love. Ownership. The lawyer continued. But my mother wasn't listening anymore. This is absurd, she said, standing up. I raised her. I'm her mother. The word mother echoed strangely in the room. I finally looked at her. Really looked. You left me, I said quietly. Her eyes flashed. I did what I had to do. So did he, I replied, nodding toward the papers on the table. For a moment, she looked stunned as if she hadn't expected me to speak at all. The lawyer cleared his throat again. Mr. Hale also included a personal letter. My mother froze. A letter. She asked quickly. Yes, he said. Addressed to my niece. He handed me an envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it. My dear girl, if you're reading this, I'm Ganond. I'm sorry for that. I never knew how to say big things out loud. So I'm writing this instead. You were 16 when your world fell apart and you never complained. You worked, you studied, you kept going. I watched you become strong without becoming bitter, and that's rare. This isn't about money. It's about knowing where you belong. I chose you because you stayed. You chose responsibility when others ran from it. Live well, live free, and never doubt that you were loved. Uncle Roberti pressed the letter to my chest. My mother stood silently, watching my reaction not with curiosity, but with anger. When the lawyer finished explaining the legal details, she spoke again, her voice sharper now. This isn't over, she said. You can't keep all of this. I didn't respond, because she was right. About one thing, it wasn't over. The call started the next day. My mother called first. Then cousins I hadn't heard from in years. Then family friends suddenly concerned about fairness. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had advice. Everyone seemed to believe I owed. Something simply because I existed. She's your mother. He was her brother. Family shouldn't fight over. Money? No one asked. Where they were when I was 16? No one asked. Who paid for my school? Who showed up? Who stayed? One evening, my mother showed up at the house, Uncle Robert's house. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes scanning the furniture, the walls, the space taking inventory. This should have been mine, she said. He wanted me here, I replied calmly. She scoffed. He was manipulated. That hurt more than I expected. He made his choice, I said. Just like you did. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You can give me what's mine quietly, or this can get ugly. I met her gaze. It already did. I said she hired a lawyer. So did I. The weeks that followed were exhausting paperwork. Meetings, old wounds reopening in conference rooms that smelled like coffee and dust. She tried to paint herself as the abandoned sister, the devoted mother. I said nothing more than the truth. The court documents didn't care about tears. They cared about facts, and the facts were simple. Uncle Robert had raised me. He had supported me. He had chosen me. The judge upheld the will. When it was over, my mother didn't look at me. She gathered her things, stood up, and walked out without a word. That was the last time I saw her. Moving back into Uncle Robert's house felt strange at first. Every room held memories. His chair by the window. His coffee mug is still in the cabinet. The quiet he loved. But slowly the house began to feel like home again. I planted a small garden in the backyard. I fixed the loose step by the porch. I framed his letter and placed it on my desk. The money helped, but it wasn't what saved me. What saved me was knowing, finally, that someone had chosen me on purpose. Sometimes, late at night, I think about my mother. I wonder if she ever realized what she lost, not the inheritance, but me. And then I remember something my uncle once said. Some people confuse blood with loyalty. He never did. The quiet after the court ruling was deeper than I expected. For weeks, my life had been filled with noise, phone calls, legal terms, raised voices, and the constant tension of waiting for something else to go wrong. When it all stopped, I didn't feel relief right away. I felt exposed, like the adrenaline had drained out of my body, leaving me alone with everything I had been holding back. I went back to Uncle Robert's house the same evening the decision became final. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the driveway. I sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside, resting my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing in slowly. This house had seen me cry quietly at the kitchen table, celebrate small victories, and grow from a scared teenager into an adult who had learned how to stand on her own. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. I set my bag down and walked into the living room, sitting in his chair by the window without thinking. It still creaked the same way. I almost smiled that night. I dreamed of being 16 again, standing in the doorway of my childhood home, holding that note, the paper trembling in my hands. But this time, when I looked up, my uncle was there behind me, steady and calm, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." A few days later, I found myself sorting through old boxes in the attic. Uncle Robert had kept everything. School photos, report cards, birthday cards I had made for him over the years. In one box, I found a folder labeled with my name. Written in his neat, careful handwriting inside were copies of my college acceptance letters. I sat down on the floor and cried. He had believed in me long before I believed in myself. There was also something else, an envelope tucked into the back of the folder. Not a legal document. Not official. Just another letter. "I never wanted you to feel like you were living on borrowed time," it read. "This house is yours because this family was always meant to be yours." I realized then that the inheritance wasn't a reward. It was protection. News travels fast, and families, especially when money is involved, relatives who had sided with my mother stopped calling. Some avoided me entirely. Others sent half-hearted messages about moving on and keeping the peace. I responded politely, briefly, and without explanation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove myself to anyone. I didn't need their approval. Months passed. I repainted the walls a soft, warm color. I replaced the old curtains. I made the space mine without erasing him. On Sunday mornings, I started drinking coffee on the porch, just like he used to, watching the neighborhood wake up. One afternoon, a woman from next door came by with a pie. I just wanted to say, she told me, "Your uncle talked about you all the time. He was so proud." I thanked her, my throat tight. That night, I sat alone at the dining table and thought about pride, about how it's built and how easily it can be destroyed. My mother had been so focused on what she felt, entitled to that, she never noticed what she had already been given, a daughter. I did hear from her once more, Anne. Email, short, cold. "You didn't have to make this so difficult." Stared at the screen for a long time before closing my laptop without replying. Because I finally understood something important. She didn't want a relationship. She wanted a share. And those two things are not the same that the inheritance allowed me to make. Choices I had never thought possible. I left a job that drained me. I went back to school part-time. I started volunteering with a local program that helped teenagers who had been kicked out or abandoned by their families. The first time a 16-year-old girl looked at me and asked, "Does it ever get better?" I told her the truth. "Yes," I said, "but not the way you expect." One evening, as I was locking up the house, I found myself standing in front of the framed letter again. Live well. Live free. I finally felt like I was doing both. I didn't hate my mother. I didn't forgive her either. I simply let her go. And in doing so, I made room for a life that wasn't shaped by her absence, but by his presence. Sometimes people ask if I regret how things ended. I shake my head, because love isn't proven by blood. It's proven by who stays. When leaving would be easier, Uncle Robert stayed. And because of that, I learned how to stay for myself. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after everything settled. That's something people don't tell you. They think closure comes with a dramatic ending, a tearful apology, a door slammed shut. But for me, closure came quietly, in ordinary moments. When I realized I was no longer waiting for my mother to come back and explain herself, I was finally done waiting. One afternoon, nearly a year after the inheritance ruling, I was sorting mail at the kitchen counter when I saw her name on an envelope, my mother's handwriting. My first instinct was to throw it away. I stood there for a long moment, holding it between my fingers, feeling the weight of everything she had never said. Then I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no greeting, no apology. Just words that felt carefully chosen, measured. "I hope you're well. I've been thinking about everything. I still believe your uncle influenced you against me, but I suppose what's done is done. If you're willing to discuss a reasonable arrangement, I'm open to it." I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly and placed it back into the envelope. She still didn't see me. She saw an obstacle. That night, I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. I thought about the 16-year-old version of myself, the girl who waited by the door, hoping her mother would return. The girl who believed love was something you earned by being good enough, quiet enough, grateful enough. I realized how far I had come and how far she hadn't. I wrote her a response, not out of anger, not out of spite, out of clarity. "I'm not interested in financial discussions. I hope you find peace, but I won't be part of this anymore." That was it. No explanation, no defense. I mailed it the next morning and felt lighter than I had in years. Letting go doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to engage as time passed. I began to see my story differently. I used to think I had been abandoned. Now, I understood I had been redirected. Uncle Robert didn't just give me a home. He gave me a blueprint for love that wasn't loud or conditional. Love that showed up every day, quietly, consistently. And because of him, I had learned to recognize that kind of love in others and in myself. The teenagers I worked with often asked about family. "Do you still talk to her?" One girl asked me once. I shook my head gently. Some relationships end so that others can begin, I told her. She nodded, as if she understood more than she let on. On the anniversary of Uncle Robert's passing, I visited his grave alone. I brought fresh flowers and stood there in the soft afternoon light, listening to the wind move through the trees. I told him about my life, about the choices I was making, the people I was helping, the peace I had finally found. I hope I'm doing right by you, I said quietly. The wind stirred, and for the first time since he died, I didn't feel the familiar ache. I felt gratitude. Not everyone gets the mother they deserve, but sometimes life gives you something better. Someone who sees you, someone who stays, someone who teaches you what love really looks like. The inheritance reading had started as a moment of fear of old wounds reopening, of being made small again. Instead, it became the moment I truly understood my worth, not because of money, but because I had been chosen not out of obligation, but out of love. And now, when I sit in this house, sunlight filling the rooms, I don't feel like I'm living in someone else's shadow. I feel rooted. I feel whole. The strangest part about healing is realizing, when it has already begun, there wasn't a single moment where I woke up and felt fixed. No grand revelation, no sudden joy. It happened in pieces, small, quiet shifts I only noticed later. When I looked back and saw how differently I was living, I stopped flinching when my phone rang. I stopped checking my inbox with dread. I stopped rehearsing conversations with my mother in my head. Her silence no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like peace. The house changed with me. I hosted my first dinner party there a year after everything ended. Just a few friends, mismatched plates, laughter that lingered in the corners of the rooms. At one point, I caught myself standing in the doorway, watching everyone talk over each other. And I felt something warm spread through my chest. This was family too. Chosen, built, earned. Through care. Later that night, as I washed dishes, one of my friends said, "Your uncle would have loved this." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I think he knew," I said, "that it would be like this someday." I began to understand that inheritance isn't always about what's left behind. Sometimes it's about what's passed forward. Uncle Robert had passed forward. Steadiness, patience, quiet confidence. He had shown me how to love without keeping score, how to give without expecting applause. And somewhere along the way, I had become that person for others. I noticed it in the way the teens at the center trusted me with their stories, in the way friends leaned on me when life got heavy, in the way I spoke to myself more gently, more honestly. I no longer felt like I had to earn my place in the world. I already had one. There were moments, of course, when the past tried to resurface. Weddings, when mothers danced with daughters, at holidays, when families gathered easily, at random times, when a smell or a song unlocked an old memory. But those moments didn't break me anymore. They reminded me of how far I had come. I never heard from my mother again. No more letters, no emails, no attempts at reconciliation or negotiation for a long time. I thought I would feel something when that realization settled in. Sadness, anger, relief. What I felt instead was acceptance. Some people are only meant to be chapters, not the whole story. One evening, years later, I sat at my desk rereading Uncle Robert's letters. The paper had yellowed slightly. His handwriting is still steady, still careful. Live well. Live free. I smiled. I am. I said out loud as if he could hear me. And in that moment, I realized something important. My life was no longer a reaction to what my mother had done. It was a response to what my uncle had given. I used part of the inheritance to set up a small scholarship fund, nothing extravagant, just enough to help kids like I once was. Kids who had been left behind, underestimated, forgotten. At the first award ceremony, a girl stood up and thanked me, her voice shaking. I didn't think anyone would believe in me, she said. I felt tears fill my eyes. I know, I told her softly, but someone does now. Looking back, I understand why the inheritance reading hurt so much. It wasn't about the money. It was about being seen finally, undeniably seen. My mother saw me as a mistake. She wanted to erase. My uncle saw me as a future worth protecting. And in the end, that made all the difference. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this. You don't owe loyalty to people who abandoned you. You don't owe silence to protect someone else's guilt. And you don't owe access to people who only show up when there's something to take. What you owe to yourselves, truth and peace. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels still, I sit by the window the way my uncle used to. I watch the lights come on across the street, hear distant laughter, feel the steady comfort of being exactly where I belong. Not because someone gave earth to me, but because someone chose me. The inheritance reading was supposed to divide us instead. It freed me. It closed a door I had been standing behind for far too long and opened a life I was finally ready to live. As I sit here now, telling you this story, I think about how many of us are still waiting for an apology that may never come, waiting for someone who left to suddenly understand the damage they caused, waiting for permission to move on. For a long time, I thought healing meant my mother would one day knock on my door, regret in her eyes, ready to make things right. I thought that moment would finally prove that I mattered, but that moment never came. What came instead was something quieter and stronger. I learned that closure doesn't always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes it comes from the person who stayed. And sometimes it comes from the moment you decide to stop carrying someone else's unfinished business in your heart. My uncle didn't just leave me a house or money. He left me certain. He showed me that love doesn't abandon, doesn't bargain, and doesn't show up late with excuses. Love stays. Love protects. Love chooses. And once I understood that, I stopped feeling like the girl who was left behind and started feeling like the woman who was guided forward. If you're listening to this and carrying a similar wound, I want you to know this. You are not unworthy because someone walked away. You are not selfish for choosing peace. And you are not wrong for closing doors that only ever brought you pain. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you have done the same? Would you have held on, or would you have finally let go? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe and support the channel, because stories like these remind us that even after abandonment, a full life is still possible.